Okay, so the second page for today's class is contemporary and experimental composition techniques. So at the beginning of the 20th century, and especially after the Second World War, there was a big break with tradition, the European Western musical tradition. And part of the motivation was also trying to detach yourself from so-called sentimentalism, or the idea that music was so much developed and meant to manipulate your feelings and perception of emotions and what's good and what's bad, the moral and romanticism, expressions of love and maybe hate as well. So one of the things that happened in the 20th century was that people are looking for more objective, almost technical ways of producing sound. So this kind of happens a little bit later. I mean, chronologically, if you think we spoke about realism and expressionism, now we kind of move a little bit to later techniques, pretty much after the Second World War. I provide here a little quote by a Czech writer, Milan Kundera, who talks about music of a French or Greek French composer, Yannis Xenakis, where he kind of explains why he loves his very abstract music. And techniques that Xenakis and other composers used were trying to break away from making traditional music. Here's an example of a piece by Pierre Boulez, who was a French composer and conductor, that uses a technique called 12-tone or serial music, where the whole design was actually to work almost mathematically with selection of tones. And by doing this, you would design this sequence in such a way that it will not have any chords, it will not have melodies, it will not have even the rhythms that repeat. And you would intentionally create, even with musical instruments, textures and kind of musical movements that will break you away from any notion of tonality. So it's almost like we go totally opposite to the idea that we had in the first homework, where we said, let's create some interesting chords and then create these movements within chords to create a feeling and emotion. Here you do create a feeling and emotion, but in some totally opposite way, and that breaks you away, puts you in this unknown territory. And some of the technical tools that he was using by rewriting that sequence backwards or flipping this by inversion, not inversion, it's inversion. So I have to correct that, and then flipping and going backwards and making a sequence both of rhythms and pitches. This is an example here. For those who never heard this kind of style of music, it might be a little almost bothering to listen because the expectations are very different. But kind of let you kind of listen to a short excerpt right now if it loads quickly. If not, you can like explore. This is a long piece, so I would encourage you to listen to some of it, and then as you get used to it, maybe try to be able to listen to this from the beginning to the end. So there are really no melodies, no harmonies, and maybe the rhythmic element is the most prominent one, but even that one is kind of serialized, so it doesn't really try to create a groove in the meter. Now the technique that the 12-tone composers used is very formal. a much more approachable technique, I would say, maybe was used by John Cage and also Xenakis. I didn't include any piece by Xenakis here, but um, for those interested, I mean, I can recommend some pieces or look him up on the web. So both Xenakis and Joe Cage explored so-called aleatoric music or randomness. So if you want to break away from notes that are arranged according to keys and chords and tonality and rhythm, you can either do this by really kind of mathematical design that almost deliberately breaks away from rules of music, or you can also use chance. Now, not every chance really gives us totally random music. Chance was used also in classical music. There is this wonderful set of musical pieces uh, created by Mozart called the musical dice game, the musikalisches Würfelspiel, that can actually use chance just by exploring permutations of possible remixes of stuff uh, to make a lot of possible musical pieces that don't sound the same every time. And Mozart was not the only one who used this technique. Apparently, it was kind of a cultural convention that people who were proficient enough in music would create these games. So what the game consisted of was a book with one measure compositions that will be numbered, and these will be the different bars, and these will be the choices of throwing two dice. So you have from 2 to 12, and with these, um, you know, 11 possibilities, you would basically throw a dice every time, and depending on the bar, you would look it up in the book, and you would recopy, you would look it up, and then for the next bar, throw a dice, and you basically would recopy every time a different small excerpt of a composition, and the the talent or the uh, ingenuity of the composer was that he could actually write this kind of puzzle um, arranged games or musical um, books that would be this dice game. That if you choose any bar here and then the next bar here, next bar here, it would still sound musically valid. So of course there is a lot of musical knowledge in writing the books that what we see is just a table, the index of which bars in this book you would recopy. Uh, but you know, trying this out on the web actually is a good uh, um, here to play online dice game. Just try this out and see, I mean, how you can kind of compose your own music uh, with practically no effort. Of course, every time it creates a different composition, they all in some sense sound very similar, different and similar, because they all have this same structure and the same chord progression. Uh, but the intent of Xenakis and Cage was not really use randomness in the way Mozart did this, but really throw out a lot of random notes and create them. So we're going to explore in the homework actually something else which is called Lexicon Sonata, and it's also an app that exists on the web. And this is one possibility. There are several other musical apps that you can use to create these very abstract compositions. So I'll talk about this later on. Before jumping to randomness or 12-tone music, I want to also mention the idea of bridging or combining voices together in terms of, you know, we said that there is no more chord structure. There is the polyphony was also broken. So how do you deal now with multiple voices? Not only that you can randomly generate your melodies or randomly juxtapose them, you can still think about dense constructions of notes together. And one of the techniques that were explored by modern composers was called heterophony, which is um, um, different technique than the conventional so-called polyphony, which is multiple voices, or counterpoint, where we actually try to really define the rules of one voice talks to another one. Heterophony did exist, or exists, in non-Western traditions like Arab music and Japanese or gamelan. Basically, have multiple simultaneous voices play variations on the same line, but they create texture. Um, it could be like really a mass of sound, and a lot of sounds that kind of create a movement that is super impressive. So one example, a piece by Ligeti called Atmospheres, was used by Stanley Kubrick in his opening to Space Odyssey. Let me also play a short excerpt kind of to give that notion of dance. This is orchestral. This is actually written for an orchestra. So here's how it sounds. So this cluster of chords, and then it starts slowly moving, and as we progress, so you have these waves of sound. There's a point where there's this huge climax, things come together and they start evolving. Okay. Very different approach as well. I mean, it gives you this atmosphere of color of sound, but it's not anything close to being like major minor chords and stuff like that. So again, explore these ways of or understanding why new methods have been developing, and has been developed and is still developing in trying to organize music in novel ways. And I will stop right now, and I'll come back to these tools just to describe their use or possible use in your assignment for this week. Yep, a couple more. So just yeah, before I log off or stop the recording, I don't log off, but stop the recording for this page. These links are important because they give you a lot of possible ways of basically the Lexicon Sonata and some other links that I provide are tools that you could use for doing your homework. Okay.